There's been a lot of talk during the year 2020, not just about coronavirus and all that kind of stuff, but also about La Nina. La Nina is a weather effect that has its impact here in the United States in particular, but globally. It is it's the opposite effect of what is known as El Nino. That's the one that's probably most prominent, the one that most people have heard of. Both of those are a part of what is known as the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or INSO, as they will abbreviate it. That, however, to understand why El Nino affects our weather the way it does, it really is a fairly involved explanation. So because of that, I am breaking up this video into a series of three. We're going to be looking at I'll be making three different videos trying to explain why El Nino affects our weather here in the United States, and indeed globally, why it affects it the way it does. So this is video number 1. This is on global air circulation. Here to help me talk about global circulation, I brought my friend, the globe. So here we have the globe. Whoops, spinning the wrong way. There we go. This is the way we would be spinning in space toward the east. And here we are in North America. Here's the Pacific Ocean, and this is where everything happens. To understand why El Nino does what it does, we have to understand the way that air circulates across the globe. So, to do that, I brought along a little diagram. I can just click that right here onto the globe. As soon as I get it adjusted to fit properly, that's close enough. There we go. So, here we have the pattern of global circulation. Here we have the equator, right here. Okay, as the air is being heated by the sun globally, it is being heated unevenly. It's an uneven heating of the globe. To understand a little bit about convection currents and unequal heating, watch my video called Why Is It Windy? Go watch that video, and I have some great illustrations in there to show why the air moves the way it does. So it not only happens locally though, it also happens on a global scale. So here we go. As the air pounds on the equator, it heats up the equatorial regions of the earth more strongly than it does other areas because the sunlight is more direct. Because of that, the air above the equator, it ends up warming up and rising, all right? And that is called the equatorial low. It's low pressure because the air is lifting off of the earth. Imagine the air is pushing on you like a weight. Well, if the air is lifting off of you, then that pressure goes from high, where it's pushing on you, to low. So rising air is low pressure. So here's this rising air, and it's lifting off of where it's heating up. The hot air is rising, it's going up there. As it rises, it cools off, and it begins to spread. Now, the same pattern happening here in the northern hemisphere is also happening down here in the southern hemisphere as well. Adjust my glove. There we go. Now I'm on the equator, right? It's also happening in the southern hemisphere, same pattern, and it's happening all around the globe. Okay, so here we go. So this warm air rises up. As it cools off, it begins to spread this way and that way. This would be the top of what's called the troposphere. That's the lowest layer of the atmosphere. That's where our weather is. And as it begins to cool off, eventually it will begin to sink. It typically begins to sink right around the latitude, around 30 north and 30 south latitudes is where that air cools off and comes down. Now, because it's warm air here is rising, it's holding tons of moisture, but it loses all of that moisture in these tropical areas, which is why the tropics are so lush with jungles and rainforests and all that, is because that rising air dumps tons and tons of rain in this area. As it comes over here and cools down, it no longer has the moisture to create rain. As it sinks, it's exceedingly dry, and it absorbs whatever moisture it can from the surface of the earth. That's why around 30 north and 30 south latitude, we have all the major deserts of the world. Not all of them, but the major ones. The Sahara and the Gobi, the southwestern United States and Mexico. All these areas are extreme deserts, and that's because this dry air coming down. hits the ground, begins to spread again. Notice it also spreads north. As it spreads along the earth, it picks up heat from the earth, it warms back up, and it rises again. This is somewhere between 50 and 60 north and south latitudes. This is why up around Washington State and Oregon, that's why we have the temperate rainforests, because of this rising air, again, dumping tremendous amounts of rain. That's part of the reason we have those temperate the rainforests in those latitudes. Warms up, rises, flows back down. This is the subpolar low. Oh, this over here, by the way, is the subtropical high, so it's pushing down. As it comes up here in the subpolar low, again, it cools off, spreads out, and eventually comes back down here in the polar high to do the same thing, pushing back down south. So there's these three major circulation cells. This one, by the way, is called the Hadley cell. This one is the Ferrel cell, and that one's the polar cell. Not really important that you know the names of these cells that represent the global circulation. It's more important you simply understand what the pattern is. So as this air is rising, if the earth were just stationary, if we're not moving anywhere, then as the air would rise, it would rise straight up, and as it would sink straight back down. But because the earth is rotating, then what ends up happening is it produces an overall effect called the Coriolis effect. What that means is that rising air, because of the rotation of the earth, rising air is forced to spin in a counterclockwise direction, where sinking air is forced to spin in a clockwise direction. Well, if we have rising air spinning counterclockwise and sinking air spinning clockwise, that has the net effect of pushing this air in a westerly direction from east to west in between those two areas. That westerly movement of air is called the trade winds. Those are the trade winds. Now up here, because here we have clockwise rotation going this way, and here up here in this area we have the counterclockwise again. That forces the air in this direction. Those are called the westerlies. And the polar high clockwise, that is the counterclockwise, and that produces what are called the polar easterlies. Okay, so we have these bands of winds that are forced along the surface, the trade winds coming this way, the westerlies going that way, and then the polar easterlies coming back. Now think about the impact that had on our planet. That impact is tremendous, because what ends up happening is, here we have Africa, okay? Columbus decides that he wants to go to India, but he wants to do it by sailing to the west and not to the east, okay? Assuming that the world was round, everyone thought he's crazy, but they went ahead and funded him, and he did it. But what did he do? He came down from up here in Europe, he came down to the Canary Islands in this area. Why here? Because this is where the winds went west because of the rotation, the Coriolis effect. So he knew that if he got into this latitude, which by the way is the same latitude over here as India, right here, same latitude as India, he knew that if he got here and just stayed on that latitude, it would blow him west. Lo and behold, though, there was this thing in the way called North and South America. That is why Columbus, when he sailed west, crashed into the Caribbean. And that is why he discovered that. Think about the Vikings. The Vikings came across from Sweden and Norway up here, and they went across first to Iceland, and then over here to Greenland, and then they kept going and they hit here. Why were they traveling that path? Because this was the polar easterlies, so it was blowing toward the west, the same as the trade winds, which is why America, because of this rotation of this pattern, it was why America was discovered in the Caribbean and up here in Newfoundland and not somewhere in the middle, because here the winds were going the wrong direction. So another thing to realize about this, and this is pretty cool too. So as this air is rising, it really creates kind of a dead area of air right here around the equator. This is called the doldrums. And this is where you end up getting stuck if you don't, there's not necessarily a significant amount of wind in this area. So sailing vessels had to be very careful when they were coming across because you might get stuck in those areas. The same thing happened as the air began to come down in this middle area. It also created a patch where everything was high pressure and very little wind. So much so that if you were carrying a lot of livestock like horses, because you ran out of wind, you had to conserve your food, conserve your water. Horses drank a lot of water, so they end up having to sacrifice the horses, and they would dump them into the ocean in these areas because they had to conserve the water because they weren't sure when the winds were going to come back. That's why these areas through here were called the horse latitudes. So we have the doldrums and the horse latitudes. All of these things, all of this discovery that was going on early on when America was being discovered and the world was being explored, it was all based on the rotation of the earth and the unequal heating producing rising and sinking air, and the rotation producing Coriolis effect, which in effect then produced all of the global winds, and that's what the sailors used to travel the globe. And that is part one of my discussion on El Nino and La Nina. First thing we have to understand is that global circulation. Stay tuned. Video number 2 is about to come out. I hope you check it out.